Helen Croft was 64 years old, and she was standing in her garden in Tucson, Arizona, pulling weeds from around the base of her tomato plants when the world ended for the second time in her life. The first time was when her daughter, Rachel, died of an aneurysm at 31, sitting at her kitchen table, mid-sentence, gone between one word and the next with no warning and no explanation and no mercy. That was 4 years ago. Helen had survived it the way she survived everything, by putting one foot in front of the other and refusing to stop moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant drowning in the kind of grief that doesn't have a bottom. Rachel left behind a son, Ethan. He was 6 when his mother died. He was 10 now. He lived with Helen in the small adobe house on Calle Esperanza, which was a street name that meant hope, and Helen thought about that sometimes, about living on a street called Hope, when hope was something she had to rebuild from scratch every single morning. Ethan was small for his age. He had his mother's brown hair and his father's serious expression, and a habit of asking questions that didn't have easy answers, like, why do people get sick? And why can't dogs live as long as people and grandma? Were you ever scared of anything? He wore round glasses that were slightly too big for his face, and he pushed them up his nose approximately 400 times a day. He read books that were 3 grade levels above his own. He was obsessed with astronomy and could name every moon of Jupiter in order, and he had a telescope in his bedroom that Helen had saved for 3 months to buy, because when a 10-year-old boy looks up at the sky with wonder in his eyes, you find the money for the telescope. Helen's neighbors on Calle Esperanza knew her as the retired woman with the garden and the grandson. She grew tomatoes, peppers, squash, and herbs. She sold small batches of homemade salsa at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. She drove a dusty Jeep Cherokee that was older than Ethan. She wore wide-brimmed hats against the Arizona sun and work boots that had more miles on them than most cars. She was lean and weathered in the way that desert people get, dried and toughened by heat and wind, until what remained was all bone and sinew and quiet endurance. Carlos Medina, who owned the auto repair shop at the end of the street, had noticed something about Helen once. A stray dog, a big one, part shepherd, had come into her yard growling and snapping, agitated by the heat or by something else entirely, and it had lunged at Ethan, who was playing in the front yard. Helen moved. She moved from the garden to the dog in a distance of about 15 feet, and she covered that distance so fast that Carlos, who was watching from his shop, couldn't track the motion. One moment she was kneeling in the dirt. The next moment, she was between the dog and Ethan, one hand on the dog's scruff, the other on its muzzle, controlling the animal with a grip that was firm but not cruel, redirecting it, calming it, neutralizing the threat in approximately 3 seconds. Carlos had spent 4 years in the Marines. He had seen people move like that, but not retired grandmothers who grew tomatoes and sold salsa at the farmer's market. "You got fast reflexes, Helen," he said to her later, trying to keep his voice casual. Helen smiled her dry, patient smile. "I've always been good with animals." Carlos didn't push it, but he noticed that Helen always knew who was behind her without turning around. And he noticed the way she scanned a room when she entered it, quick and automatic, the way someone checks mirrors when they drive, not because they're thinking about it, because they can't stop. The phone call came at 2:15 p.m. on a Wednesday. Ethan walked home from school every day. It was 4 blocks. Helen had walked the route with him dozens of times, identifying every house, every yard, every dog behind every fence, every intersection. She had taught him to stay on the sidewalk, to cross at the crosswalk, to look both ways, and to never ever get into a vehicle with someone he didn't know. She had taught him these things the way all grandmothers teach these things, with love and repetition. But underneath the love and repetition there was something else, something more systematic, more thorough, something that came from a place deeper than normal grandmotherly concern. Ethan didn't come home at 3:20. He didn't come home at 3:30. Helen called his phone at 3:35. No answer. She called the school at 3:40. The office confirmed he had been dismissed at 3:05. She got in the Jeep and drove the route, every block, every intersection, every alley. At 3:55, she found his backpack. It was on the sidewalk on Calle Mariposa, 2 blocks from the house, lying on its side next to a fire hydrant. His astronomy book was on the ground beside it. His glasses were on the pavement. One lens was cracked. Helen picked up the glasses, She held them in her hand. She looked at the cracked lens. She looked at the empty sidewalk and the quiet street and the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. The phone in her pocket rang. Unknown number. She answered. Mrs. Croft. The voice was male, calm, American accent with something underneath it. A cadence that suggested time spent in places where English was not the primary language. We have your grandson. He's unharmed. He'll stay that way as long as you follow instructions. Who is this? My name doesn't matter. What matters is that you owe a debt. Not a financial debt, an operational debt. You took something from the people I work for, a long time ago. In a place very far from Tucson, they want it back, and they're willing to trade your grandson for it. Helen stood on the sidewalk holding her grandson's cracked glasses, and she felt the desert wind on her face, and she felt the sun on her shoulders, and she felt, deep in the bedrock of her body, something shift. Something that had been sealed and buried and covered over with years of tomato plants and salsa recipes and Saturday morning farmers markets. Something old and vast and absolutely lethal. What do they want? She said. There's a hard drive. You removed it from a compound in eastern Syria in 2014. It contains financial records, communication logs, and the identities of assets embedded in 3 governments. Your agency was supposed to destroy it. You kept a copy. My employers want that copy. Helen said nothing for 5 seconds. She breathed. The desert air filled her lungs. Dry, hot, familiar. The air of the place she had chosen to disappear in because the desert was the landscape she understood best. The landscape where she had spent the most important years of her life. The landscape that had given her the name that a very small number of people in the world still whispered when they talked about the things that happened in the shadows. You have 6 hours, the voice said. I'll call back with the location for the exchange. If you contact law enforcement, we'll know. If you contact your former agency, we'll know. If you do anything other than exactly what I tell you, the boy disappears permanently. Do you understand? I understand, Helen said. But I want you to understand something too. You think you know who I am. You think you've read a file or heard a story and you think that tells you what I'm capable of. You're wrong. The file doesn't cover it. The stories don't come close. You took my grandson, the only person left in this world that I love. You've given me 6 hours. That's 5 hours and 50 minutes more than I need. She hung up. Helen Croft drove home. She walked into her house. She walked past the kitchen where Ethan's cereal bowl from that morning was still in the sink. She walked past his bedroom where the telescope pointed at the window, and his astronomy books were stacked on the nightstand. And his bed was made because Helen had taught him to make his bed every morning, and he did it without complaining, because he was that kind of kid. She walked past all of it and into her own bedroom and opened the closet. Behind the hanging clothes, behind a false panel that was indistinguishable from the wall unless you knew exactly where to press, was a space roughly the size of a small suitcase. Inside that space was a Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol with a threaded barrel, a suppressor, 3 magazines, a combat knife, a pair of compact binoculars with night vision capability, a satellite phone, 2 passports under different names, $8,000 in cash, and a small black hard drive, approximately the size of a deck of cards, sealed in a waterproof case. Helen had not always been Helen Croft. She was born Helen Morrow in El Paso, Texas. She grew up in the desert. She learned the desert the way some children learn music or mathematics, instinctively, completely, as if the landscape was a language, and she was born fluent. She could navigate by stars, by sun position, by wind direction, by the angle of shadows on sand. She could find water where there was no water. She could move through open terrain without being seen by observers who were specifically looking for her. The desert was not a hostile environment to Helen. It was home. It was the medium through which she moved the way a fish moves through water. She was recruited at 22 by the CIA's Special Activities Center. Her linguistic abilities, fluent Arabic and conversational Farsi, combined with her desert expertise and her physical capabilities, made her a natural fit for operations in the Middle East and North Africa. She completed the Ground Branch Selection and Training Program, which eliminated the vast majority of candidates, and she completed it at the top of her class. She served for 23 years, 23 years of operations across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, Jordan. Places where the desert stretched to every horizon, and the difference between life and death was often determined by who understood the terrain better. Helen always understood the terrain better. She moved through the deserts of the world, the way other operatives moved through cities, reading the landscape, using it, disappearing into it. She could cross open ground in daylight without being detected by observers with binoculars. She could travel 50 miles on foot through featureless terrain and arrive at a precise set of coordinates within a margin of error measured in feet. She could lie motionless in a concealed position for days, enduring heat that exceeded 130 degrees, surviving on minimal water, waiting for the moment that the mission required her to move. Her call sign was Desert Ghost. She earned it in Iraq in 2006 during an operation that became legend within the Special Operations community. Her team was compromised 60 miles inside hostile territory, communications destroyed, vehicles disabled, 3 team members wounded. Helen took command. She led them across 60 miles of open desert in 3 days, navigating by the stars, moving at night, hiding during the day under improvised concealment in terrain that offered almost no cover. She found water in a dry wadi that every map said was empty. She evaded 4 separate search patrols, each time detecting them before they detected her, and rerouting the team through terrain so inhospitable that the pursuers didn't bother to search it. She brought every member of her team home alive. The enemy forces searching for them found nothing. No tracks, no trace, no sign that anyone had ever been there. A ghost in the desert, seen by no one, found by no one, there and then gone. She retired at 45 when Rachel was born. She chose Tucson because the desert was in her blood, and she couldn't live anywhere that didn't smell like creosote and dust after rain. She married a quiet man named Robert Croft, who worked for the Forest Service, and who died of a heart attack 8 years later. She raised Rachel. She built the garden. She started the salsa business. She became the woman on Calle Esperanza, and now someone had reached into that quiet life and taken the only thing in it that mattered. Helen assembled the pistol. She loaded the magazines. She attached the suppressor. Her hands moved with the fluid, automatic precision of 23 years of muscle memory. She had assembled this weapon in sandstorms, in moving vehicles, in the darkness of hide sites in the Iraqi desert while hostile patrols passed within 30 meters. Doing it in her bedroom in Tucson was the easiest thing she had done in 20 years. She picked up the satellite phone and dialed. "This is Desert Ghost." The silence on the other end lasted 5 seconds. Then a voice, male, American, controlled in the way that voices are controlled when they belong to people who manage assets that officially don't exist. "Ghost, you've been inactive for 19 years. Someone took my grandson. They want the Qadir hard drive. The Qadir drive was supposed to be destroyed. I kept a backup, insurance, the kind you hope you never need. Who took the boy?" American voice, trained. "Knows about the 2014 Syria operation. Knows about the drive. This is someone with access to classified operational history, either a former agency officer or someone who bought the information from one." Silence. Then, "We'll run analysis on the voice signature if you can get a recording. In the meantime, I can have a team in Tucson in 4 hours. I don't have 4 hours. I have 6, and I'm not spending them waiting. I need you to trace the phone number that called me and give me a location. That's all I need. Helen, you're 64 years old. If these people are who you think they are, I've been 64 years old in this desert for every one of those years. I know this ground better than anyone alive. They brought this fight to my landscape. That's the last mistake they'll make." The trace came back in 40 minutes. The phone that called Helen was a burner, but it had connected to a cell tower near a location 16 miles southeast of Tucson, in the desert south of Vail. Cross-referencing with satellite imagery showed a cluster of structures at the location, an abandoned ranch property, 3 buildings, 2 vehicles. Thermal imaging was not immediately available but would be within 2 hours. Helen didn't wait for thermal imaging. She knew the area. She had hiked it, driven it, studied it during the 19 years she had lived in Tucson. She knew every wash, every ridge, every road, every cattle trail. She knew where the ground was hard enough to drive on, and where it would swallow a vehicle to its axles. She knew where the terrain offered concealment, and where it offered nothing but exposure. She left at dusk. She drove the Jeep to a trailhead 8 miles from the ranch property and covered the remaining distance on foot. She moved through the Sonoran Desert the way she had moved through the deserts of Iraq and Syria and Libya, slow and patient and perfectly attuned to the landscape. The saguaros stood like sentinels in the fading light. The ground was rocky and sparse with creosote and brittlebush, and the occasional cholla cactus that glowed gold in the last rays of the sun. She navigated by terrain features she had memorized years ago, adjusting her route to use the washes and ridgelines for concealment. She reached the ranch property at full dark. The stars were out, dense and brilliant in the way they only get in the desert away from city lights. Ethan would have loved this sky. He would have pointed at Jupiter and named its moons in order, and asked her if she thought there was life on Europa, and she would have said, "Maybe, baby, maybe," and his eyes would have gone wide behind his 2 big glasses. The ranch consisted of a main house, a detached garage, and a small outbuilding that might have been a storage shed or a bunkhouse. 2 vehicles were parked near the garage, a black SUV and a tan pickup truck. Lights were visible in the main house. The outbuilding was dark. Helen established a position on a low rise 200 meters north of the property. She observed through the binoculars for 90 minutes. She counted 4 men, 2 inside the main house visible through windows, 1 seated at a table with communications equipment, and 1 moving between rooms. 1 in the garage, which had been converted into some kind of operation space with additional equipment visible through the open bay door. 1 outside, walking a loose perimeter that took him around the main house and the outbuilding in a circuit that lasted approximately 12 minutes. She watched the perimeter guard complete 3 full circuits. She timed him. She identified his pattern, where he paused to check his phone, where he stopped to light a cigarette, where he cut a corner close, and where he swung wide. She found the gap. On the south side of the outbuilding, the guard's circuit brought him within 10 feet of the building's door, but he never checked it. He walked past it every 12 minutes and didn't look at it because whatever was inside the outbuilding was not his concern. His concern was the perimeter. The outbuilding was someone else's responsibility. Ethan was in the outbuilding. Helen was certain. The building was dark, which meant whoever was inside couldn't signal for help. It was separate from the main house, which meant the hostage was isolated from the operational center. Standard hostage holding protocol. Keep the assets separate from the command element. Reduce variables. Helen had spent 23 years studying how hostages were held. She had recovered hostages from compounds in Fallujah, from apartments in Beirut, from cave complexes in the Afghan mountains. She knew the patterns, she knew the logic, and she knew the weaknesses, because every holding protocol had weaknesses, and the weakness here was that 4 men were spread across 3 structures, with a 12-minute perimeter rotation, and they were operating in a landscape that belonged to her. She moved at midnight. The desert was cold now, the temperature dropping the way it drops in the Sonoran winter, fast and deep, the heat of the day evaporating into a sky so vast that the cold seemed to come from the stars themselves. Helen moved through the cold and the dark with the patience of a woman who had once crossed 60 miles of Iraqi desert in 3 days. 200 meters was nothing. 200 meters was a walk to the mailbox. The perimeter guard passed the south side of the outbuilding at 12:07 a.m. Helen let him pass. She counted. She had 12 minutes. She moved to the outbuilding door, simple padlock. She picked it in under a minute. She eased the door open. The interior was dark and smelled like dust and old hay and motor oil. She stepped inside. She waited for her eyes to adjust. Ethan was in the corner, sitting on a folding cot, his knees pulled to his chest, his arms wrapped around his legs. His face was pale in the darkness. His eyes were red from crying. His wrists were bound in front of him with zip ties. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn to school that morning, the blue t-shirt with the solar system on it, his favorite, the one Helen had bought him at the Science Museum gift shop. He saw her and his mouth opened and Helen was there before the sound came out, her hand gentle over his lips, her face close to his. "It's Grandma," she whispered. "I'm here. Don't make a sound, baby. Can you do that?" Ethan nodded. His eyes were huge behind the darkness. He didn't have his glasses. They were still on the sidewalk on Calle Mariposa with the cracked lens. He was seeing the world in blur, but he could see his grandmother's face, the face he knew better than any other face in the world, and the relief that flooded through him was so total that his entire body went limp. Helen cut the zip ties with the knife. She pulled Ethan against her chest and held him for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of being a grandmother. 3 seconds of feeling his heartbeat against hers, and his small hands gripping her jacket, and his breath warm against her neck. "Are you hurt?" she whispered. "No, they didn't hurt me. I was scared, Grandma." "I know, baby, you were brave. Now I need you to be brave for 5 more minutes. Can you do that?" "Yes." She picked him up. He was 10, but he was small for his age, and she was strong in the way that desert women are strong, lean and tireless. The kind of strength that doesn't show in muscle definition, but shows in endurance, in the ability to keep going long after the body says stop. She carried him to the door. She checked the perimeter. The guard was on the far side of the main house. She had 7 minutes before he came back around. Enough time. She moved. Ethan on her hip, pistol in her right hand, moving north across the open ground toward the rise where she had established her observation position. The desert floor was hard and rocky, and her boots made almost no sound on it. The stars were overhead, dense and silver, and the cold was sharp and clean, and the only sound was the wind moving through the creosote bushes. They were 100 meters from the ranch when the outbuilding door, which Helen had closed but could not relock from the outside, swung open in the wind and banged against the frame. The sound carried across the still desert air like a gunshot. Helen heard the perimeter guard's voice, a shout, then another shout from inside the main house. Lights came on. The garage bay door opened. She heard the sound of boots on gravel and voices raised in alarm, and the specific, urgent chaos of men who had just discovered that their hostage was gone. She moved faster, not running, moving. Controlled, deliberate, fast movement across terrain she knew in her bones. Ethan's face was pressed against her shoulder. His arms were around her neck. She could feel him trembling. "Close your eyes, baby," she said. "Count the moons of Jupiter for me." Out loud, quietly. "Yo," Ethan whispered against her shoulder. "Europa, Ganymede, Callisto. Keep going. Amalthea, Himalaya, Ilara." She reached the rise. She set Ethan down behind a cluster of rocks and knelt in front of him. "Stay right here, don't move, keep counting." "Grandma." "Count, baby." She turned back toward the ranch. 2 flashlight beams were sweeping the desert south of the outbuilding. The men were searching in the wrong direction, toward the road, the logical escape route. They didn't know about the trailhead 8 miles to the north. They didn't know about the Jeep. They were looking for vehicle tracks on the access road because that's what made sense. That's what logic dictated. And they were dealing with a 64-year-old grandmother, so logic should have been sufficient. But logic didn't account for the desert ghost. Logic didn't account for 23 years of moving through landscapes like this and leaving no trace. Logic didn't account for a woman who could cross open desert without leaving tracks that anyone but a master tracker could follow. And there were no master trackers at this ranch, just 4 men with flashlights and rifles, and a rapidly deteriorating understanding of the situation they were in. Helen moved parallel to the search line. She circled south, using the terrain, staying in the washes where the sandy bottom swallowed footprints, moving behind the ridge lines where the flashlight beams couldn't reach. She approached the ranch from the southeast, the direction they had already searched and dismissed. The first man she encountered was the perimeter guard. He was standing near the outbuilding, his rifle at his side, speaking into a radio. Helen came out of the darkness behind him and applied a chokehold. He struggled. He was young and strong, and she was 64, and her arms ached with the effort, but she had choked out men in worse conditions than this, in sandstorms, in 130-degree heat, in the back of moving vehicles, and she held on until he went limp. She zip-tied him with ties from his own tactical vest and gagged him with a strip of cloth from her pack. The second man was in the garage. He was at the communications equipment trying to reach someone on a satellite phone. Helen entered through the side door and crossed the distance before he turned around. She controlled his weapon hand, stripped the rifle away from him, and put him on the floor with a technique that used his own weight and momentum against him. He hit the concrete hard enough to daze him. She secured him. The third man was near the access road, sweeping his flashlight across the dirt, looking for tire tracks. Helen moved through the desert to a position behind him, waited until he turned away, and closed the distance in 4 quick steps. He heard her at the last second and spun around. Too late. She drove the heel of her palm into his solar plexus, and followed with a controlled strike to the side of his neck. He dropped. 3 down, 1 remaining, the one inside the house, the one with the American voice and the knowledge of the Qadir hard drive and the operational history. The one who had planned this. Helen entered the main house through the kitchen door. The house was old, adobe, with thick walls and small windows, and a layout she had assessed from her observation position. Kitchen to living room to bedroom to a back room that served as the operations center. She found him in the operations center. He was standing at a table covered with maps and photographs and a laptop that was open to a satellite image of her house on Calle Esperanza. Her garden was visible. Her Jeep was in the driveway. Ethan's bicycle was in the yard. He was in his 50s. Lean. Gray hair cut short. He wore civilian clothes, but he stood the way military men stand. Weight balanced, shoulders set. He had a pistol on his hip. His hands were at his sides. He turned when Helen entered. He looked at her. A 64-year-old woman in work boots and a desert jacket, holding a suppressed pistol with the casual familiarity of someone who had carried one for longer than most people carry anything. "Helen Morrow," he said, "the desert ghost." "You know who I am," Helen said, "which means you know how this ends." "I was agency too," he said. 15 years. Clandestine service. I know what you are. I studied your operations at the farm. They used your Iraq extraction as a case study. 60 miles across the desert. No casualties, no trace. He paused. I always wondered if it was real. It was real. Then you know what this is about. The Qadir drive contains identities that certain people would pay a great deal to recover. People who are still embedded. People whose exposure would destabilize operations across 3 countries. I'm not the villain here, Helen. I'm a broker. I'm facilitating a transaction. You took my grandson. I needed leverage. You took a 10-year-old boy from a sidewalk 2 blocks from his home. You took his glasses off his face. You zip-tied his hands. He was afraid. He cried. He's 10 years old and he spent hours alone in the dark, wondering if his grandmother was coming for him. Helen's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was low and even and it filled the room the way sand fills an hourglass, grain by grain, relentless and inevitable. Here is what happens now, she said. You are going to sit down. You are going to put your hands on that table, and you are going to wait for the people I've already called to come and collect you. The hard drive stays with me. It will be destroyed properly, by people I trust, not by brokers, and not by the kind of men who kidnap children for leverage. The man looked at her. She could see him calculating, measuring his chances, weighing the pistol on his hip against the pistol in her hand, weighing his 15 years of clandestine service against her 23 years of direct action operations in the most hostile environments on Earth. You're 64, he said, and you're standing in my desert, Helen said. I have been a ghost in landscapes like this since before you finished your first assignment. I walked 60 miles across Iraq with 3 wounded teammates and didn't leave a footprint. I have entered compounds that were harder to breach than this ranch, and left without a single person knowing I was there. You studied my operations at the farm. Then you know that if I decided this conversation should end differently, it would already be over. Sit down. He sat down. He put his hands on the table. Helen secured him. She picked up his satellite phone and checked his communications. She found messages confirming what she already suspected. He was working independently, a former officer who had gone freelance, selling access and information to the highest bidder. The people who wanted the Qadir drive were a private intelligence firm with connections to foreign governments. The kidnapping was unauthorized by any agency. It was a private operation conducted by a private operator who had made the catastrophic miscalculation of targeting the grandson of the desert ghost. The FBI arrived at the ranch at 4 a.m., 3.5 hours after Helen's satellite phone contact had routed the information through channels. 2 helicopters, 16 agents, full tactical response. They found 4 men secured and restrained across 3 structures. All weapons collected and cleared. The operations center intact with evidence laid out on the table. The scene was, in the words of the lead agent, the most professionally processed site she had encountered in 14 years of field work. She noted in her report that the individual who had conducted the operation appeared to have done so alone, on foot, across 8 miles of open desert at night at the age of 64. The former officer was charged with kidnapping conspiracy, and violations of the Espionage Act related to the unauthorized brokering of classified intelligence. His trial lasted 3 months. The evidence was comprehensive. He received 22 years. The 3 men he had hired for security were charged as accomplices and received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. The private intelligence firm that had contracted for the Qadir drive was identified, and its operations were disrupted through a joint investigation involving 3 allied intelligence services. The Qadir hard drive was turned over to the CIA under a chain of custody that Helen personally supervised. It was destroyed in her presence at a secure facility in Virginia. She watched it go through an industrial degausser, and then a physical shredder, and then she watched the shredded remains get incinerated. She stood there until there was nothing left but ash. Helen drove back to Tucson. She picked Ethan up from the FBI field office where he had been looked after by a victim's advocate who had given him hot chocolate and a blanket and had let him watch a documentary about the solar system on her laptop. He was wearing a pair of borrowed glasses that didn't quite fit, and he was holding the hot chocolate with both hands. And when Helen walked through the door, he set the hot chocolate down so carefully, so deliberately, the way a 10-year-old does when he's trying to be grown up, and then he ran to her and wrapped his arms around her waist and pressed his face against her stomach, and he didn't say anything for a very long time. Helen put her hand on his head. She held him. The FBI agents in the room looked at each other and looked away because there are moments that belong only to the people inside them, and this was one of those moments. "Grandma," Ethan said eventually, his voice muffled against her jacket. "I counted all the moons. All 79? 95, they found more." Helen smiled. A real smile. The kind that started deep and worked its way up through the layers of everything she had been, and everything she had done, and everything she had survived until it reached her face and settled there like sunlight on the desert floor. "Then you'll have to teach me the new ones," she said. They drove home in the Jeep. The sun was coming up over the Catalina Mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. The saguaros stood along the roadside like old friends. The desert stretched in every direction, vast and patient and eternal, and Helen drove through it with her grandson beside her, and the windows down and the morning air filling the cab with the smell of creosote and dust, and the particular clean emptiness of a landscape that had been her home, and her weapon and her sanctuary for as long as she could remember. Ethan fell asleep before they reached Calle Esperanza. He fell asleep with his head against the window, and his borrowed glasses sliding down his nose and his mouth slightly open, and Helen looked at him and saw everything she had ever fought for, and everything she would fight for again without hesitation. She carried him inside. She put him in his bed. She pulled the covers up and tucked them around him the way she had tucked them every night since Rachel died. She picked up his telescope from the windowsill and angled it toward the part of the sky where Jupiter would be visible that evening, because when he woke up, he would want to look, and the eyepiece should be ready. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. She sat at the table and looked at the garden through the window. The tomato plants needed watering. The peppers were almost ready to pick. The Saturday farmers market was in 3 days, and she needed to make a new batch of salsa. The pistol was back behind the false panel in the closet. The satellite phone was beside it. The passports, the cash, the knife, all of it put away, sealed, silent. Helen Croft drank her coffee and watched the morning light move across her garden and listened to her grandson breathing in the next room. And the house was quiet, and the desert was still, and the ghost was home. She had been a ghost for 23 years. She had moved through the deserts of the world and left no trace and saved American lives that would never know her name. She had done things in the dark that kept the light safe for people who would never know the dark existed. And now she grew tomatoes and made salsa, and raised a 10-year-old boy who counted the moons of Jupiter, and drew pictures of the solar system, and looked up at the sky with wonder, because the world was still full of things worth wondering about. Some people wear capes. Helen wore work boots and a wide-brimmed hat, and she was the most dangerous person in the Sonoran Desert, and nobody knew it except the desert itself, which had always known, which had always recognized her, which had given her its name because she had earned it across 60 miles of Iraqi sand and 23 years of silent, faithful, invisible service. The desert ghost, retired, growing tomatoes on a street called Hope. If you believe that true heroes carry scars and not capes, share this story.